This is BBC 4. Over to our news team now for BBC World News Today.
This is BBC World News Today with me, Kasia Madera. Does North Korea already have the technology to mount a nuclear warhead? The US Secretary of State plays down reports it can, while warning the North that any kind of missile launch would be a huge mistake.
We are all united in the fact that North Korea will not be accepted as a nuclear power.
David Cameron takes his family to a German castle for the weekend, but some prickly politics about EU membership could be served up at dinner. Also coming up, their original owners claim they were stolen and want them back. So why were these Native American masks sold at auction in Paris? And from the West End to Broadway, Matilda the musical makes its debut on a foreign stage. Could it be the start of a global phenomenon? Hello and a very warm welcome. Well, another day and the rhetoric over North Korea is getting more heated. The US Secretary of State John Kerry hit out at the secretive state and demanded that any missile launch be abandoned. He said it would be a huge mistake. He made the comments in South Korea in a show of support for the US ally and in an effort to lower the tension between the two neighbouring countries. Our World Affairs correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports from the South Korean capital, Seoul.
The new US Secretary of State is welcomed by the new president of South Korea. Together, these two must decide what the world should do about another new leader, North Korea's Kim Jong-un and his nuclear weapons.
We are all united in the fact that North Korea will not be accepted as a nuclear power.
The problem for Mr. Kerry is that's like putting the nuclear genie back in the bottle. North Korea has proved it can launch long-range missiles and explode nuclear devices. And on Thursday came this astonishing revelation by a US congressman from a US intelligence report.
DIA assesses with moderate confidence the North currently has nuclear weapons capable of delivery by ballistic missiles. However, the reliability will be low.
I choose not to comment on it.
Okay.
If North Korea has managed to acquire the ability to build nuclear-tipped missiles, then it changes the strategic map of this whole region. Pyongyang has long been able to threaten Seoul with thousands of artillery pieces just over the mountains behind me here. But nuclear missiles would give North Korea the ability to threaten US bases in Japan and maybe even the US itself. Even if it hasn't got there yet, North Korea's recent successful launch of a long-range rocket shows it is getting closer and closer.
Americans can say what they want, the entire world community can say what they want, but it's not going to change the hard fact of life. North Korea has got nuclear devices and they are working hard to develop a full-scale nuclear and missile capabilities.
There is a sad logic to North Korea's nuclear ambitions. These pictures, smuggled out of the north, show the reality of life there now. Ox carts have replaced tractors, firewood is the only fuel. While billions are spent on the military, markets are virtually empty. Nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantee that America will not try to topple a regime that inflicts this misery on its own people.
Well, to discuss this further, we're joined by Leon Segal from New York. He's an author on North Korea and is also director of the Northeast Asia Cooperative Security Project at the Social Science Research Council. Now, the US have been rather dismissive about this report. What is your assessment of North Korea's capabilities?
Well, first of all, it's important to know that we didn't have full evidence from their last nuclear test. And so there's a little bit of guesswork involved, and clearly the intelligence community is divided. The fact is, North Korea is getting closer to developing something that they could mount, a warhead they could mount on a missile. And that's a fact of life. how close they are, whether it's one nuclear test away. The key here is, can we get into negotiations with the North to head off further nuclear testing?
Well, it's difficult to assess what they want from this. We saw in Rupert Wingfield-Hayes' report there the rather miserable conditions of North Korean people in everyday life. Is this their attempt to keep a guarantee that the status quo will stay, that their regime will stay?
Well, yes, in part. I mean, clearly this has a domestic component, but most importantly, it has an international component. North Korea is much weaker than South Korea militarily, in the air, on the ground, at sea. And so this is a kind of guarantor that it won't be attacked. North Korea may be paranoid about being attacked, but, you know, we've just gone through some serious military exercises. We're in the middle of them with South Korea, and we've flown B-52 bombers on practice bombing runs, B-2 bombers on practice bombing runs. So, you know, that heightened, I'm sure, the concern in North Korea. The question really is, what do they want out of this? One possibility is that this is, in the end, they're still on the track of trying to negotiate a new relationship with the United States and South Korea. It's never been about money. That's a false assumption that people make, and a lot of people in Washington make. This is about the relationship. It's an open question whether we're still on that track with the North. The latest statements, authoritative statements out of Pyongyang suggest we may no longer be on that track. They may be on a track where they want to build up a significant amount of nuclear weapons and missiles. But we've got to explore that with them. We've got to see whether they mean it. In the past, we've had statements that have gotten reversed. This may be another case. We don't know. The way to find out is to negotiate.
Well, in your experience, North Korea has a new leader. Do they actually want war, or is this just simply hot air?
Well, the hot air is about the attacking Seoul and all that. And that has been exaggerated partly in Western media, which plays the verbiage back without noting that every single statement of threat is conditioned on first being attacked by the South or the U.S. Again, whether they mean it or not. Clearly, they don't have the capacity to launch an all-out attack on Seoul without committing suicide. So one assumes that the rhetoric is the rhetoric. What isn't rhetoric, what is real, is they are moving ahead with their nuclear and missile programs. And they are now seem to be working toward a test of a new missile that at least is capable of reaching Japan and possibly Guam. They clearly have made headway on the nuclear weapon side. The latest test does suggest that they have a fairly efficient device, maybe not quite ready to mount on a missile. It takes a little bit more than just the device to get ready to mount on a missile. And of course, there's the question of the missiles.
We will, of course, have to watch and wait, see what their next move is. Leon Segal, apologies for interrupting, but we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining us. Right, let's get some of the day's other news. It sounds like an ideal weekend away. Take your wife and kids to an idyllic castle in Germany. But for British Prime Minister David Cameron, this is no holiday. He's gone there tonight to discuss his demands for reform of the European Union with the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Our Europe editor Gavin Hewitt reports from Merseburg.
David Cameron and his wife Samantha arrived by helicopter at an 18th century castle north of Berlin, the country retreat of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. The Prime Minister's 3 children will be joining them. They were met by the German Chancellor and her husband Joachim Sauer. The Chancellor's spokesman said, "The visit demonstrates how tight our friendship and partnership with Britain is. Adults and children," he said, "will have a lovely time." Despite the informality, there are key differences. David Cameron wants a more flexible EU. Angela Merkel is pushing for more Europe. David Cameron sees changing EU treaties as a chance to renegotiate British membership. Angela Merkel sees treaty change as a risky distraction.
I think she's trying to tell him, I really like you. I really want you on board. And that is true. She absolutely wants not only Cameron, but Britain on board.
But as regards Angela Merkel supporting treaty change,
I don't think it's realistic at all, because it goes against everything that Merkel wants. Merkel does not want treaty change.
Germany is not inclined to open the door to a substantial British renegotiation.
Whilst David Cameron was preparing to make his case here inside the German government guest house, there were further indications today of just how deep-seated the Eurozone problem remains as finance ministers were meeting in Dublin. Cyprus bailed out just 3 weeks ago, still causing concern.
Before the meeting of finance ministers in Dublin, the president of Cyprus said he would appeal for extra help. It has emerged that Cyprus will need to raise an extra €6 billion to secure its bailout. A lot of details remain to be settled, even while European officials said they were ready to sign off on a €10 billion rescue for Cyprus.
I want to welcome today's political agreement reached on the Memorandum of Understanding for the Cyprus programme. Negotiating this programme has been a long and very difficult process, as we all know. Now it is important that the decisions are implemented effectively so that Cyprus can move forward.
Back in Germany, the government is doing all it can to defuse the Eurozone crisis before an election in the autumn. And that makes it difficult for David Cameron to negotiate a more flexible Europe he can sell to the British people. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Germany.
Let's get some more on this. We're joined from our central London studio close to Westminster by the Financial Times political correspondent Kieran Stacey. Kieran, we saw Cameron and Merkel in that rather cosy setting there. They should be natural allies, but their views on Europe are far from close.
Well, to a certain extent, they do agree on quite a lot. The first two items on the agenda this weekend are going to be two things they agree almost entirely on. The first is about reducing the amount of red tape there is for small and medium-sized businesses. Both Germany and the UK are completely as one on that. The second one is agreeing an EU joint position to be able to take to the US to agree a free trade agreement with the US, which would be a huge deal if they actually managed to pull it off. They both agree on that. However, there are two key things that they're going to discuss this weekend that they don't agree on. The first of which, as we were just hearing from Gavin there, is about treaty change. The Germans are quite suspicious, quite wary of ripping up the EU treaties when it comes to renegotiating the way business is done in the Eurozone. The second one, of course, is Syria. Now, UK and France together both want to be able to arm the Syrian rebels, but at the moment they're stopped from doing so by an EU embargo. And they want Germany to sign up with them to actually relax the terms of their embargo. That comes up for renegotiation next month. And David Cameron's actually going to make a personal plea this weekend to Angela Merkel to say, back us on this one. We really need to be able to do this. There's a humanitarian disaster there, and this is the only way to solve it.
And Cameron is also in this ditch between what his backbenchers want and what he can actually deliver in terms of what the other European Union leaders will accept. How does he get out of it?
It's a very good question. It all depends on how much Germany, particularly Germany, but other European countries as well, are going to go along with what Britain wants, which is some kind of renegotiation of what powers belong in London and what powers belong in Brussels. Last time I was talking to someone quite senior from the German Foreign Ministry, they were saying all that we're willing to really trade here is some of the stuff that's currently going through the Commission. So we're not talking about handing back any powers, we're just talking about them not doing things that they might have been about to do. And the one thing they talked about specifically was having quotas of women on boards. Well, if David Cameron comes back to his backbenchers and says, look, this is what I've got from the Commission, they're no longer going to have quotas on women on boards, his backbenchers will turn around and go, is that it? Well, if that's the case, we're going to back pulling out of the EU altogether. So he really needs something quite significant on the Working Time Directive, for example, or justice rules. And at the moment, nobody is backing him, really. Even his closest allies, the Dutch, for example, think that he might have pushed his case too far. Really, the Brits are just hoping something will happen over the next few years and the rest of Europe will turn around and go, well, if it's a choice between this and having the UK leave the EU altogether, all right, here you go, here's something back.
OK, Kieran Stacey, we'll see how their weekend goes from the Financial Times. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now let's take you to northern Nigeria, and a BBC investigation has revealed the level of toxic lead contamination around a cluster of villages in Zamfara province. 450 children have died from lead poisoning in the past 4 years. People use lead to help them extract gold from local mines. Now the medical charity MSF has accused the Nigerian government of a slow and ineffective response to the contamination. Tommy Oladipo has this special report.
Some of the worst affected victims of Zamfara's lead poisoning crisis. Symptoms here include paralysis and even brain damage. In the village of Sumke, 4-year-old Umaima can neither hear nor speak. Her mother, Hajara, says they used to process gold ore at home, and this is how her daughter was contaminated. Zamfara has rich gold deposits. These miners take incredible risks, spending days underground trying to dig their way out of poverty. They bring the rocks here for processing, but there's a high concentration of extremely toxic lead in the dust that's released. Experts say the levels are the highest in the world. A lot of the processing used to happen here in the village, and even now the men are bringing the dust back home on their tools and clothes. For the children, this creates a poisonous playground. At least 8 villages in this area have been contaminated in what is one of the world's worst cases of lead poisoning. Hundreds of children have died and thousands more have been left needing urgent medical attention. Here in Bagega, that includes more than half of all children under the age of 6. This treatment center is run by the aid group Doctors Without Borders. Children receive medication which helps clear the lead from their bodies. This can take up to 15 years. Aid workers worry the government may not have the capacity to take over this treatment.
The State Ministry of Health and the Federal Ministry of Health, they are not active on the ground. There is funds which has been released for medical intervention through the Federal Ministry of Health. Up to today, we have not seen them. And lead treatment is a complicated treatment. It needs a lot of training.
The government denies the accusation and puts the blame back on the community itself.
This is a man-made disaster. It's not a natural disaster. Illegal mining is the underlying reason for this. Lack of awareness is behind it. We can't sit behind and sort of not to take anything, take action. Government will continue to take all steps to protect the lives and well-being of its people.
Efforts are now underway to clean up the environment. Toxic soil is replaced with clean earth. It's slow work, partly because they don't have the equipment that the government was supposed to supply. Medical help can only be given once all the poisonous soil has been removed, and that hasn't happened in Bagega village. Aid agencies and villagers are asking why the government has not been treating this as an emergency, because that's what it is. Gold mining may be lucrative, but lead is proving to be a highly damaging byproduct. As long as mining is allowed to continue, thousands of children will pay a high price. Tomi Oladipo, BBC News, Zamfara, northern Nigeria.
Now let's get some of the day's other news. Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir is making a historic visit to neighbouring South Sudan. President al-Bashir and his southern counterpart are expected to discuss territorial and border disputes, as well as a recent agreement on how much the South should pay for exporting its oil through Sudan. And President Vladimir Putin says Russia is to invest $50 billion in its space program in the next 7 years. He was speaking during a visit to a site near the Chinese border where Moscow is building a new launch pad for space flights. Mr. Putin said the first manned flight from the new facility is expected in 2018. Now, they're made from wood, leather and horsehair, and in Arizona, Hopi Indians consider these masks sacred. So the Native Americans were angered when a collection of the masks came up for auction in Paris. They attempted to stop the sale by heading to court, but it didn't all go to plan, as Christian Fraser now reports.
They are a weird and wonderful set of carvings, stitched in a vivid array of colours. They would catch the eye of many a collector. But to people of the Hopi tribe in northeastern Arizona, they're not masks but sacred vessels, imbued with the spirits of the dead and still used today in a traditional Hopi ceremony. It's forbidden to sell them to outsiders. The tribal elders believe they were stolen. But in a Paris court, their last-ditch attempt to block the auction failed.
The court decided to let the sale proceed because those masks, as sacred as they may be for the Hopis, are not bodies, human bodies, alive or dead, or body parts. And the court felt that's the only thing that could have been protected, with which I disagree.
The trade of sacred tribal artifacts is banned in the United States, but the law doesn't extend to their sale overseas. Nonetheless, the American government had appealed for a postponement so the Hopi tribe could determine the provenance of the collection. But the auction house insists the masks were collected legally by a Frenchman who'd lived in the United States for 30 years and was selling anonymously.
It's a controversy which has come around a little late because most of these objects were sold by the Native Americans themselves 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And then all of a sudden, they're sacred. They're no longer sacred because they've entered into collections and they're no longer in use in the Native Americans' religion. That's it.
The auctioneers said they'd received some quite serious threats ahead of the sale, but when the hammer eventually fell, the bidding was brisk. The collection, which will now be scattered, went for a total value of €930,000. The most expensive piece fetched €190,000, 4 times its estimated value. Christian Fraser, BBC News, Paris.
An international team of scientists has revealed the most complete reconstruction yet of a possible human ancestor. Their analysis of 3 partial skeletons, each 2 million years old, and possibly from the same family, shows the species had a human-like pelvis, hands and teeth, but a foot like a chimpanzee. Our science correspondent Palab Ghosh has more.
Could this be the missing link between apes and humans? These bones are of a species called Sediba, who lived in southern Africa 2 million years ago. Its bones have features that are both ape and human-like. Scientists have pieced together Sediba's skeleton and discovered how it might have moved.
She walked in a very different way than most humans do today, and in fact she walked in a different way than other Australopithecus species in the past walked. And it tells us that there were many different forms of bipedalism that evolved over the course of human evolution.
Her joints and leg bones suggest that Sediba was pigeon-toed, with her feet pointed inward. It was an awkward way of walking, but it helped the species climb trees. Sediba is the most human-like ape of its time. Scans show that its brain is beginning to grow, and some believe that this hand would be dexterous enough to make and use tools. Scientists used to think there was a linear evolution from ape to human, but it turns out there were lots of species around millions of years ago that were human-like. Gradually they died out, leaving only one, us. Researchers say that the new discovery has shown that the story of human evolution is more complex than we previously thought.
We've got a series of creatures which are human-like in various ways, but in different ways. So they show different mixtures of human-like and what we might call primitive features. Somewhere in that group is the real ancestor of later humans, and I think we don't yet know where that ancestor was.
The research is revealing how humans evolved from apes and helping to answer a more profound question of what it truly is to be human. Palab Ghosh, BBC News.
Now, the award-winning British musical Matilda, inspired by a book by Roald Dahl, has just opened on Broadway. It's the show's first overseas foray, so will it become a global musical phenomenon along the lines of Les Miserables? From New York, Tom Brooks reports.
It's arrived in New York. Matilda the musical, telling the story of a very clever 5-year-old who prevails despite abusive parents and a deeply vindictive headmistress.
An exception to the rules in my school.
That headmistress is played by British actor Bertie Carvel, who was in the London production. For him to have the musical arrive on Broadway is a wondrous achievement.
The best thing about being here for me is that I'm so proud of what we've made, and to kind of ascend to this moment is thrilling.
This musical has been a huge success in Britain, winning a record-breaking 7 Olivier Awards. It's a Royal Shakespeare Company production that reaches children and adults.
I think there's something universal in the story that it is about imagination and how words can inspire imagination, and it's about it's okay to be clever.
This very British musical hasn't really been Americanised for its transfer to Broadway. It stayed true to the dark, cutting tone of Roald Dahl's 1988 novel on which it's based. Nearly all of the cast is American, but they speak with British accents, including the 4 young actresses who rotate in the role of Matilda.
We had a dialect coach, and it took a few, maybe like 2 months or something like that. Yeah, about that. We are revolting children living in revolting times.
There's levity in Matilda and nastiness. It could alienate some American theatregoers.
It's content that's very real world, real life content, but a lot of people go to Broadway for the escapism. They don't want to see sort of the tough material. The question is whether people will be genuinely entertained, by Matilda, and whether they'll, feel like it's sending a good message to their kids.
With every swallow you are tightening the noose.
Matilda is trying to reach beyond Broadway. It has the potential to become an international theatre franchise, a British musical capable of spawning money-making productions around the world.
I think it's a very real potential. We have to take things, as they say in sport, a day as they come, and see how we go. But it's really the interest in it from audiences from across the world, when they've been seeing it in London, has been very, very strong.
But first, Matilda has to triumph on Broadway. Early indications suggest that it will. Advance ticket sales have been very strong, and the all-powerful New York Times theatre critic has given Matilda a very positive review. Tom Brooke, BBC News, New York.
Weren't the actresses fantastic? Well, that's all from the programme. Next, the weather, but for now, from me, Kasia Madera, and the rest of the team, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Good evening. The weekend promises to bring a real mixture of conditions, wet and windy at times, but for all of us, it's going to turn milder. And if we see a little bit of hazy sunshine on Sunday, it could actually feel quite warm in places. But as we head through tonight, we've got a weak ridge of high pressure just easing its way through. That's going to kill off the showers we've had in parts of the southeast during the afternoon. And we'll see a largely dry night with some clear spells, perhaps a touch of frost across the north of Scotland. But as we head through Saturday, well, things are going to change as wet and windy weather begins to march its way in from the southwest. So some rain pushing its way through southwest England. In fact, the heaviest of that probably clearing by about 4 o'clock. But it will be turning increasingly wet for Wales and through other southern areas of England. 10 degrees in London, so although we'll have the rain, it is going to feel quite mild. And with this rain, some pretty strong and gusty winds as well. Patchy rain getting into the Midlands and East Anglia. Northern England probably dry, and across Scotland a largely dry story here. More in the way of brightness than we've seen over the last couple of days. But that rain will be starting to work its way in towards Northern Ireland. Now, as we head through Saturday night, the rain continues to push northwards, carried on this warm front here. And behind the front, we have a wedge of really quite warm air that sits in place during Sunday. We're going to have quite a lot of cloud in the southeast, but with the warm air, if we get a bit of sunshine, temperatures could get quite close to 20 degrees. But further west, some outbreaks of showery rain, very strong winds, gales or severe gales in the northwest, but at least mild for everyone. If you want more details on the weekend prospects, find them online.
This evening on BBC4, we begin with love, rejection and tragedy in the Royal Opera House's acclaimed production of Eugene Onegin in just a moment. Then a celebration of the legend from the valleys, Tom Jones. There's an Imagine special at 10:10, his best visits to the BBC at 11:10, and he goes back to his roots in session at 12:05.
This place, which sometimes seems as difficult to grasp as water itself, has exerted an enormous influence on the whole course of Western civilization. And if you want to understand how this watery world has shaped our modern world, there's no better way to begin than by exploring the rich story of its art.
From Rembrandt to Rubens, Vermeer to Mondrian, join Andrew Graham Dixon as he explores the high art of the Low Countries. Continues Thursday at 9 on BBC4.